So we're not going to do it. So then we'll just do Surigo Aliyah. Yeah. Okay. So that we'll do El Melod right now.
سوريغو عليا سوريغو عليا طاهر بيعش بدود يعلي فيا سوريغو عليا سوريغو عليا طاهر بيعش بدود يعلي فيا يشبه من ربخان من شين اليمية مش حمل وبنيها وصيا الرباية سوريغو عليا سوريغو عليا طاهر بيعش بدود يعلي فيا سوريغو عليا سوريغو عليا طاهر بيعش بدود يعلي فيا شاري مرينا فوقها بحتملوا بسقيا نبتنوا اتبددين لأمن نخريا سوريغو عليا سوريغو عليا طاهر بيعش بدود يعلي فيا سوريغو عليا سوريغو عليا طاهر بيعش بدود يعلي فيا رباية ربها ربها قليلية بدينها ترتيرة تشبع وشية سوريغو عليا سوريغو عليا طاهر بيعش بدود يعلي فيا سوريغو عليا سوريغو عليا طاهر بيعش بدود يعلي فيا سوريغو عليا طاهر بيعش بدود يعلي فيا سوريغو عليا سوريغو عليا طاهر بيعش بدود يعلي فيا لما الدم المغني من السن والنادية لو يشيروا اللون فغف الدورية سوريغو عليا سوريغو عليا طاهر بيعش بدود يعلي فيا سوريغو عليا سوريغو عليا طاهر بيعش بدود يعلي فيا سوريغو عليا سوريغو عليا طاهر بيعش بدود يعلي فيا سوريغو عليا سوريغو عليا طاهر بيعش بدود يعلي فيا سوريغو عليا سوريغو عليا طاهر بيعش بدود يعلي فيا سوريغو سوريغو عليا طاهر بيعش بدود يعلي فيا
Two, 1, 2.
Okay.
Shabbos has ended, the new week has begun, the last week of the Jewish year. When Shabbos began, we welcomed the angels of peace, and now we wish the angels of peace farewell, and hope that they return to us again next week. Seitchem l'shalom, malachei shalom, malachei elyon, melech malachei hamlach, baruch. Seitchem l'shalom, melech malchei hamlachim hakadosh baruch hu. Elai lai lai lai lai, yai lai lai lai lai lai lai, yai lai lai yai lai lai lai lai. Lai lai lai lai, lai lai lai lai lai lai, lai lai lai lai, lai lai lai Sason b'maynei Yeshua, l'Adonai Shemcha birchatecha sela, Adonai tzvot imanu mitzkablanu Elohei Yehudim ha'ta'or, v'simcha v'sason v'kar, Yehudim ha'ta'or. Keinti Tetza Uveshem Adonai Ekra. La la la la la la la la la la la la la la. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen, borei peri hagafen. Lai lai la la la la lai lai lai lai la la la la lai lai lai lai la la la la lai lai lai la ya la lai ya lai la la la la lai lai lai ya la la la la lai lai ya la la la la lai lai lai lai la la lai. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei minei v'samim, borei minei v'samim. Yai lai la la la la lai lai lai lai la la la la lai lai, yai la la la la lai lai lai lai la la lai, yai lai la la la la lai lai lai lai la la la la lai lai, ya la lai lai lai lai lai lai la la lai. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei ha'esh, borei me'orei ha'esh. Lai lai la la la la lai lai lai la la la la lai lai, ya la lai lai lai lai lai lai ya la lai lai lai la la la la lai lai lai lai la la la la lai lai, ya la lai lai lai lai lai lai. Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Mortil ben kodesh lechol, ben or lechoshet. Ben Yisrael ha'amim, ben yom hashvi'i, v'sheshet yemei ha'maseh. Baruch atah Adonai, hamavdil ben kodesh lechol. Lai lai la la la la lai lai lai lai la la la la lai lai ya la lai lai lai lai lai lai la la la la lai ya la la la la lai lai lai lai la la lai Amabdil ben kodesh lechol Chatoteinu hu yimchol Sarenu v'kaskenu yarbech achol v'chakochavim balayla Shavuatov, Shavuatov, Shavuatov, Shavuatov, Shavuatov, Shavuatov, Shavuatov, Shavuatov Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi, Bimhera v'yameinu, Mashiach ben David, Mashiach ben David, Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi. Anenu v'anenu, Avinu malkeinu, chonenu v'anenu, ki ein banu maasim. Aseh imanu, tzedaka v'chesed. Aseh imanu, tzedaka v'chesed, v'hoshienu. Aseh imanu, tzedaka v'chesed. Aseh imanu, tzedaka v'chesed, v'hoshienu.
What are we leaving? Yeah? Where are we going? Are we gonna sit down? This one is hard to get through. This is the one, I guess. Yeah, you gotta take that. That's the only one.
Got the paper. Hear it from down there. Where would you prefer to be? Where is it better down near the people or up there? Yeah, okay, we'll leave it there. Okay, good evening, everyone. Shabbat Tov. Tonight we are going to do The Sephardic tradition begins Selichot the month before at Elul and does Selichot every morning and every night. It's a different way of doing it. So tonight, we're going to do the Ashkenazic timing of the holiday, which is the Saturday night before, but we're going to do the Sephardic tradition of Selichot. And the Sephardic tradition developed a beautiful set of Selichot prayers, a beautiful set of prayers which reflect on human sinfulness, the capacity of human beings to do what's wrong, and the grace of God to offer us forgiveness. And the beautiful piyutim, the word is piyut, which means poetry. The beautiful piyut, the beautiful music, the beautiful meditative spirit of the Sephardic tradition will be ours tonight. So before we begin these penitential prayers, before we begin the service, the Selichot, I thought it'd be a good idea to get some background about this. So our guide tonight is Professor Sarah Stein, who teaches Jewish history at UCLA, and is an expert in the Jews of the Ottoman Empire, which, as she'll tell us in just a moment, were Jews who escaped from Spain, came across the Mediterranean, and created them an empire. It's behind blast doors because it was blown apart some years ago by a terrorist. There's a tremendously proud and powerful community, even to this very day. So we welcome Professor. Good. Please.
Okay, Shavua Tov, thank you so much. I will attempt to bridge the distance between us, little learning and dialogue with you about the Sephardic tradition, and specifically about a piece of Sephardic musical history that I thought would be relevant to this evening's events and the beautiful music that preceded me and that will follow me. So I want to introduce you this evening to a man named Saadi Bisalel Ashkenazi Alevi, who lived in the 19th century, who was a musician, a composer, a performer, an editor of the first Ladino language, Judeo-Spanish Ladino language newspaper in the Ottoman Empire, and whose family, his grandfather and his great-grandfather before him and his sons after him, were among the most important editors in the Ottoman Empire of all measure of books, religious works, wedding invitations, plays, literature in Ladino, the Judeo-Spanish language, and also in Hebrew. This man, Saadi Bisalel Ashkenazi Alevi, was known by contemporaries by his first name, Saadi. And in addition to his accomplishments, which I've begun to outline to you here, he was also a rebel. And he crafted his rebelliousness through the two media that he loved the most, that were closest to his heart. One was music, and the other was writing. And this rebellious streak that he possessed pitted him not against the Ottoman establishment, as you might think, but against the rabbinical establishment of his hometown, which was the city that Jews knew as Salonika, had many names by the many multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic residents that called it home, but today that is Thessaloniki, Greece. Now, before I get into his story, I wanted to lay a bit of the context out for you. And I've also distributed for you a text that we will read together in the middle of my conversation with you. But on, I think, the second or third page of that material, you'll see a map, which might be a useful starting point. Now, we in English, and also in Israel in Hebrew, tend to be, frankly, very lazy about how we break down the Jewish world. We tend to lean very heavily on the categories of Sephardic and Ashkenazi. And as shorthand, we talk about Ashkenazi as the European Jews and Sephardi as the Middle Eastern, Mediterranean Jews. But historically, this wasn't the only way to break down the Jewish cultural world. There were many, many Jewish languages. There were many divisions within the Ashkenazi world and many divisions within the Sephardi world. And within the Sephardic cultural orbit, Most Jews through early modern and modern history lived in the lands of Islam. But in fact, within these communities, there were Arabic-speaking Sephardic Jews, there were Italian-speaking Jews, there were speakers of Judeo-Greek who didn't consider themselves Sephardic for the most part until the 20th century, and even then many of them continued to cling to the traditional term for that community, Romaniot. And across the Jewish world too, there were many categories of Jews, as well as many Jewish languages that we have really forgotten. Not that they have fallen out of the pages of Jewish history, but in popular parlance, in the popular imagination, we still lean very heavily in the United States and in Israel on this division of Sephardic and Ashkenazi. But in many ways, it is an artificial one, and it erases many, many differences among the complicated communities of Europe and the Middle East and Mediterranean. So the figure that I'm going to be speaking about tonight, Saadi, we'll call him as his contemporaries called him, as I say, lived in southeastern Europe, in the city of Salonika, which you see on this map, marked among the many Jewish communities of southeastern Europe, and it is north of the area then known as independent Greece, where current-day Thessaloniki is on the Adriatic. And you can see that this territory of southeastern Europe, in the year this map represents, 1908, still represents the Sephardic heartland, the Ottoman heartland of southeastern Europe, that would break down catastrophically from the perspective of the Jews who lived there, would break down during the First World War and the two wars that just preceded it, the Balkan Wars. Now, the Ottoman Empire, if you think back to history lessons, Jews who fled Iberia in the 15th century, fleeing the Inquisition, the Jews from Spain, who in their diaspora would be known as Jews from Spain, the Sephardic Jews, Jews from Sepharad. They went where they could. Where did they go? 15th century. The bulk went to the Ottoman Empire. Others to Morocco, I heard someone say. Some went south to Morocco. Some went to Europe, to Amsterdam, later to London, not immediately to London, they weren't permitted. Some went to southwestern France. They just crossed the mountains into southwestern France. So we have, and some went to the Americas, following the boundaries, the expanding boundaries of the Dutch and Portuguese empires. But the numeric majority who left Spain for the first time as a diasporic Spanish-speaking people, the Jews from Spain, went to the Ottoman lands. And they carried with them what a fleeing people can carry, which is not much. You can carry your traditions, you can carry your name, you can carry your religious practice, and you can carry your language. And they carried with them, in the same way that the Jews who were expelled from Central Europe, from Ashkenaz, carried with them their language, they carried a medieval Spanish language that they intermingled with Hebrew, and as they journeyed and as they settled, they intermingled with other languages that they encountered, with some Turkish, with some Italian, with some Greek, and so on. Now, when these Jews went to the Ottoman Empire, creating the Sephardic diaspora, they were not the only Jews to live in the Ottoman Empire, and they weren't the first either. There was a much older community of Judeo-Greek, Romaniot Jews. There were Arabic-speaking Jews across what we think of as the Eastern Mediterranean, Syria, some of the music I understand we'll be hearing the repertoire, Jews who lived through the Ottoman area of the Mashriq into Iraq, all the way to the border of Iran. Most of those Jews that I just mentioned were speakers of either Arabic or Judeo-Greek, And for the most part, they wouldn't have considered themselves Jews from Spain. It's only later that we began to think of all of these Jews through the Mediterranean and the Middle East as one category. And this has a lot of reasons. I'm not going to bore you with them. In Israel, the reasons are different. In Israel, these groups were conglomerated as Edot HaMizrach, the people of the East. But in English, in the United States anyway, for the most part, we talk about them as Sephardic. But as I'm saying before, they weren't really one discrete group. And for this reason, in the major cultural capitals of the Ottoman Empire, and among them would be Istanbul, Edirne, Izmir, Salonika in southeastern Europe, and spreading through the rest of the Middle East, places such as Baghdad, Aleppo, Jerusalem, Sfat, and others. In these places, the Jewish communities were always very diverse. Salonika had dozens of synagogues, over 30 synagogues. And these synagogues tended to define themselves around the identity of the place where the Jews had come from. And these identities were very specific. They weren't abstract like Sephardic or Spanish. They were town-specific. So you might go to the Livornese synagogue because your family came from Livorno or Leghorn in Italy. It's in this city, Salonika, where our protagonist, who we will encounter today, it is in this city where he grew up, although his family was a kind of hybrid of the Jewish world. His mother was from Italy, his grandfather was from Amsterdam. Even so, he and his family came to represent Sephardic culture on paper in their home city of Salonika. Now, one of the things that's very unusual about the place that Saadi called home, and I'm slowly meandering my way to a musical story. One of the things that is very unusual about this community, and I spoke with your community about Sephardic history, I don't know when, roughly a year ago, and I think we spoke about this together then, is that Salonika was one of the few places in the modern Jewish world that had a Jewish majority. A Jewish majority. So you were more likely walking through the streets of the port city of Salonika to hear Ladino spoken, Judeo-Spanish, than any other language. Now, there were other cities in the modern Jewish world that had more Jews. Of course, what do we think of as the demographic Jewish capital of Europe? Where are the biggest populations, or of the world? If we think of the 19th century, the early 20th century, Warsaw is absolutely the biggest Jewish center. New York City comes to be also a major demographic center. But if we think differently, if we think in terms of proportion and how large a culture looms, we have to think of Salonika and other cities through the Middle East and Mediterranean where Jews were a majority population. Now, when Saadi, our friend Saadi, was already an adult and had been raised in a publishing house. As I said, his father was a publisher, his grandfather was a publisher, his great-grandfather was a publisher. They were not the only Jewish publishing family in the Ottoman Empire. The first printing press in the Ottoman Empire was created by Jews. This was a Jewish profession up until a point. The family, though, were incredibly prominent in their home city of Salonika as printers. But Saadi had another talent, and in this he was different from his father and his grandfather. He was, as I said, a musical master. And it is extremely interesting that he learned his talent at the feet of a Muslim teacher. Not a Jewish teacher of music, but a Muslim teacher. And this tells us something about the culture of music in the Ottoman and also Middle Eastern and Mediterranean world at this time. His time, 19th century, but this was really true through the early 20th century. Jewish musicians Christian musicians, Muslim musicians, Sufi musicians, they learned, they practiced together. And not only did they learn and practice together, but they often practiced in the spaces that were accessible to a multi-religious group, which were religious spaces, including synagogues. And they performed both music in today's language we might call secular and also religious together. And Saadi was part of this culture, part of a culture, a multi-ethnic musical culture that mixed musical influences. And I think that you can, although I'm not an ethnomusicologist, and Asher, are you Asher? Okay, Asher could certainly speak to this in a more educated way. We've met by email, but not in person, educated way than I could. But the music itself contains the traces, the evidence of this mixing. And he could speak about it in vocabulary that I don't necessarily have, but perhaps also our ears can hear this to some degree. So Saadi was a musician, he was a composer, he composed poetry on the occasion of a visit to his city by the Ottoman Sultan. He composed heroic poetry talking about the Sultan's extraordinary deeds. This was Sultan Abdul Hamid of the late 19th century. And he also was known to compose music of praise, poems of praise, in praise of God, that he would set to music and perform. And it is in this vein that I brought to share with you some of his words, some of his writing, and that is in the little pamphlet that you have in front of you. And I've already given you a bit of the background that introduces this material, the background that appears on page 69. Oh, and I should say that on the cover of this little packet, you'll see the name of a book. It says Sephardi Lives. It's a collection of original documents about the Judeo-Spanish Sephardic world that I edited with a colleague of mine, really because we were frustrated as teachers, frustrated that our students had access to so few sources about the Sephardic community and written in the voices of Sephardic men and women and children or families across the historical sweep. And this text that we will read together is one of the documents that we compiled in a hefty book that reaches from the year 1700 to the year 1950 and creates a kind of corpus for the first time of original documentation about the Sephardic Jewish community. So the introduction you see on page 69 lays out some of the context that I just described to you. But it is on the following page that I think that we really see Saadi's own voice coming through. Now, I'm going to begin on the second page, about a third of the way down the page that begins with the title, Turkish Music in the Synagogue, The Objections of a Rabbi. So he writes, "Let me tell you a story, my dear readers." I'll let you find that. It's actually almost the middle of the page. "Let me tell you a story, my dear readers. I did tell you earlier that I, the author of this account, lost my father at the age of 5 or 6 and my mother at the age of 16 or 17, and that I was left with a 10 or 12-year-old brother who had kidney disease. Under these circumstances, I dedicated myself body and soul to my printing business, but my income was pitiful. I had a great love of the art of singing, given my promising voice. Among Jews, we had a certain maestro who knew many Hebrew songs. He knew some 20 fasils and various makams, and I should say that some of these words are defined in the footnotes down below, with 3 peshrevs, bestes, kiares, samayas, etc., etc. He also knew the chants of the days of awe. His name was Harav Aaron Barzilai. In a previous celebration, he had heard me sing a couple of Turkish songs I was taught by the Turkish master singer Merteza İzzediyenyolu, who had an extraordinary voice. This maestro liked me almost as if I were his own son and used to ask me to sing with him in various festivities. Maestro Harav Aaron Barzilai also took me under his wing, teaching me all that he knew. At that time, a certain rich and scholarly Signor Hacham had to marry his son. This Hacham was Harav Yehuda Alkalai, who ran the great yeshiva of Rabbanim in his house called the Alkalai Yeshiva. Twice a year, he held a reception for the Hachamim with me and my younger brothers as singers, younger brother. A day before the wedding, he invited me to sing in his house for the 8 days, on condition that I arrange a new song for the Kiddush chanted during the wedding ceremony. I composed a melody based on the Kaddish, while I also asked 4 to 5 handsome young men to join me for rehearsals to prepare them to sing it. The synagogue was filled with Rabbanim, Hachamim, and the entire aristocracy of Salonika before the arrival of the groom. When the time for the singing of the Kaddish came, my colleagues and I ascended the bima to sing the Kaddish in the Huzam mode. The multitude of people in the synagogue attending the wedding were overwhelmed with this Kaddish they were hearing for the first time in this brand new melody. All of them congratulated me for my skillful rendition, except for the Signor Rav Harav Shaul, who paid no attention to my singing, having never in his lifetime enjoyed any singing. When he went home, accompanied by 8 to 10 of his friends, he removed his cape and sat on his elevated cushion for some rest. He was asked if he had enjoyed the Kaddish that Saadi had arranged based on a Turkish melody. The Signor Rav hit the roof when he heard this question, saying, "What a wicked person to sing a Turkish melody inside the synagogue. Immediately, go and tell Harav Yehuda that he cannot employ such a wicked one for his celebration." Now, I won't read this all the way through. If you keep reading, you will know that Saadi is condemned for this sacrilegious act of mixing a Jewish religious melody, a Jewish religious prayer, with a Turkish musical mode. Now, I want to talk about why this was so scandalous, and about why Saadi took pen to paper to write about the incident that otherwise would have been lost to history. Now, perhaps I can ask you, the floor is open, why would it be so scandalous to bring into the synagogue an element of Turkish music? Speculations. The answer offered is assimilation. And I would say yes and no. You're on the right track. I'll tell you why I say yes, and then I'll tell you why I say no. I think that there is a sense that the rabbis involved are threatened by the idea that Jewish culture might be, in their view, diluted, mixed with non-Jewish culture. And when Saadi says Turkish, he actually means Muslim Turkish. He is also, by some measure, Turkish. So he means Muslim in this context. So in that sense, the answer, I think, is a very fair one. The concern is about, on the part of the rabbis at the time, the concern was about the blurring of boundaries that divided Jews from Muslims and from other religious groups. Now, I wouldn't use the word assimilation as a historian because we're terribly picky. And the reason why I wouldn't use the word assimilation is because there really wasn't assimilation in the Sephardic world in the same way that there was in the Ashkenazi world. We don't have widespread intermarriage. We don't have, until very, very late, really almost the 1920s, we don't see Jews taking on non-Jewish languages as their mother tongue, which we see all across Europe. We don't see the emergence of a reform movement, or even a breakaway spiritual movement like Hasidism, which we see in an older period in Eastern Europe. None of these things existed for the Sephardic world. And historians have asked why. Why do we not have assimilation in the same way? And the answer that a number of historians have given, many of them turn to rabbinical writings. And they suggest, the historians suggest, that the rabbinical writings, the rabbinical interpretations, the questions and answers around Jewish law, point to the fact that the rabbis themselves were more flexible in their reading of law. They were more lax, and so it was less dangerous, it was less threatening to interpret the law inventively. But this is not that answer is not what we're seeing here. What we're seeing here is a rabbi who was furious by this introduction of non-Jewish culture into a sacred Jewish space. And although it's not represented in this source itself, what happens next is really quite shocking. What happens next is that the rabbinical establishment of Salonika decides that Saadi and one of his sons should be excommunicated from the Jewish community because of their excesses. And they lay blame on this musical act of irresponsibility. And it's claimed that the son was also, one of his sons was also spotted in breaking the Sabbath by smoking. They are excommunicated. On a dramatic day in the 1860s, they are actually chased through the city of Salonika, pursued by what Saadi himself calls rabbinical henchmen. Whether it's exactly a fair description or not, I'm not sure. Pursued through the streets. And according to this excommunication, a ruling of excommunication, a cherem in Jewish tradition, other Jews would be forbidden from engaging in commerce with Saadi and his family. He would be forbidden from praying with a minyan. And of course, it was a terrible symbolic shunning. And he was devastated. He considered himself religiously observant, even though he was inventive, as this musical story tells us. And he was so agitated, he was so upset, that what he did to vindicate his name was write a memoir. And this story that we read together today is a selection of his memoir. And the memoir is really written to clear his name, to tell his story, to tell his family's story, to present a story of his world of Salonika as he knew it, and to pin blame for all kinds of problems in Salonican society on the rabbinical establishment, which he felt was careening out of control. Now, I want to offer a little digression about the digression. The first digression was about the excommunication, but the second digression has to do with the memoir itself. There is a second book that I've been involved in publishing, which is a translation of the full memoir written by Saadi. He finished it in the 1890s. And I published it in English translation and also in transliterated Ladino with two colleagues of mine, Aaron Rodrigue, a professor of Jewish history at Stanford University, and Isaac Jerusalmi, who was of blessed memory, both a ordained rabbi and an incredibly erudite scholar of Ladino linguistics and many other Semitic languages. So we translated this memoir. The memoir itself had been dictated to a scribe, written in beautiful handwriting, in the unique cursive of Ladino, which is known as Salitreo. Salitreo is a Hebraic alphabet used particularly in the handwriting of Ladino cursive. This is just to show you how hard it is to be a historian, the variety of Jewish languages one has to explore. The scribe wrote this document in the late 19th century, and sometime thereafter, Saadi gave the only copy to one of his sons who had left Salonika for Paris. The son had the only copy of this memoir written on a very inexpensive notebook, the kind one spill of water and the whole thing would have been destroyed. He had it in his home in Paris for some decades. And rather miraculously, he chose to give up this rare document of his father and send it to his nephew, who had moved to Rio de Janeiro. Soon after he sent this small notebook to Rio de Janeiro. Paris was occupied by the Nazis. The Jewish community of Salonika was eradicated, and many of you will know that the Salonican Jewish community suffered among the very highest rates of destruction of any Jewish community in Europe, 97 to 98%, depending on where you count. The manuscript was in Rio, and the nephew of the son of Saadi, as he grew older, passed it to his own children, who finally in the 1970s decided to donate this manuscript, which they could no longer read, it wasn't a language or alphabet they could read, to the manuscript collection of the Hebrew University. And there it sat, sadly miscatalogued for a few more decades until it was discovered by my colleague at Stanford, and we set out to translate it. So that is to say that every Jewish text has a rich story. After finishing that memoir translation project, I set out to find out what happened to this luminary family from Salonika. And that question, which seems so simple, took about 10 years to answer. And I'm now finishing a book on what happens to the family, the descendants of Saadi Alevi, a story that takes me from the 19th century to the 1970s. So if we move back to Saadi Alevi's own world, what I maybe will say before we move to some conversation, and I'm not sure what our time allows, but I can keep talking or we can move to conversation. If we move back to the world of Salonika in the 19th century, what we see is an incredibly culturally rich community, a demographically strong community, but a community divided. And previously I said that the rabbinical establishment was wary of what we might call a secularization of Jewish culture. But it wasn't only the Jewish community that was changing. It was also the Ottoman state that was changing, and the whole empire around this family and this community. And one of the changes that was coming to play is that Jews in the Ottoman lands would be granted citizenship, like other citizens of the Ottoman Empire. This might seem to be a high point in the history of Sephardic Jewry, this granting of citizenship, but in fact, it was an act that took away from the Jewish community a great deal of cultural autonomy. They had, like so many Jews in the orbit of Islam, Jewish communities in the Ottoman lands had the power to oversee their communities, to tax them, to create schools for the children, to decide in what languages children should learn, to take care of widows and orphans, to oversee the koshering of foods, and on and on and on. So this moment when the Ottoman Empire decided to change women and men who were Jewish in the empire from subjects of empire to citizens, we're so used to thinking of legal opportunity as a good thing, but it was a very difficult thing for the Jewish community because it pulled their authority away. And that is the other context in which we have to understand Saadi's struggles with the religious leadership. It wasn't just the idea that Jews would bring Turkish music into the synagogue that ruffled their feathers. It was also that they were losing authority that the state had given them for centuries. And it was really a cultural moment of crisis for this community, certainly transition. So there's a famous, literary metaphor in the Yiddish world, a metaphor created by Sholem Aleichem, the famous Yiddish writer, when he created the character who would become the center of Fiddler on the Roof, Tevye. Tevye was, I say, a literary metaphor because he had girls, a series of girls, and those girls each chose a different path that represented in some ways what it meant for Jews to be modern. Do you remember what happened to the daughters? One left, one emigrated. Another marries a non-Jew. And a third becomes a political radical. These are some of the paths that Jews took in the Yiddish-speaking world, in the Eastern European orbit. These are some of the ways that Ashkenazi Jewry was shaken by modernity. And in the Sephardic world, the paths were different. And Saadi watched as his children walked down different kinds of paths. Perhaps too much to go into now, although if you'd like, I could talk about it during our questions and conversation, but no less than in Boiberik, in the town of Tevye. In Salonika, this moment of the late 19th century was a moment of profound change. And music played in the synagogue was a kind of metaphor, an embodiment of all the changes, the dynamism, the excitement, and the pain that came from change that surrounded an entire community. So I would say when we listen to this repertoire, though it may reach into different parts of the Middle East than Saadi himself knew, and though it may reach outside the Judeo-Spanish world into the Arabic-speaking one, there is a very interesting common thread which we could talk about, in my language as a historian or in the language of an ethnomusicologist who might pay more attention to the music itself. There is a story about not just continuity and the nature of Sephardic culture, but also a story of change and how music charts change and expresses change and also can be an irritant to those who fear it. So that might be a nice moment. It's always good to stop with an irritant. So that might be a nice moment to transition if you have questions, please. He didn't. So the question is if Saadi left Salonika after his excommunication. He didn't move. He, as a young man, probably in his 20s, he traveled, and you can chart this on the map if you wish, he traveled from Salonika to Vienna. He traveled there for the express reason of acquiring letters for his press, the metal square letters used in the press of that day. He never traveled further the rest of his life. He would never travel further. And eventually, the cherem essentially just kind of evaporated. So the rabbis had the power to excommunicate him, but they really didn't have the power to make sure that the excommunication was heeded. So he gets reabsorbed into the community, but he never forgets. Yes?
This may be a little off the subject, but it's something very curious to me when we talk about the people of Salonika and nearly 100% were decimated during the Holocaust. Is there any parallels? Is there any data, any information about what made that particularly unique? Was it a geographical thing, or rather than carrying life, the story that you brought, the kind of community that the people had in Salonika, was there any correlation to that?
Yeah, it's
Particularly aggressive?
Yeah, it's just a terribly poignant question. The question, for those who might not have been able to hear, is why is the decimation, it's not only actually just in Salonika, but it's in Greece in general, although Salonika is the demographic center. There is a reason. And the reason is that the Nazi SS occupies Salonika directly. So again, thinking back to books and courses that we have all taken and read, the pace of deportations across Europe during the Holocaust varied depending on the exact political status of who was overseeing the occupation. And the worst thing that could happen is for you to be a Jew, well, one of the worst things, directly occupied by SS authorities because they were extremely thorough. If you lived in a place where local police carried out a deportation order, there was a chance that you could escape. But when the SS occupied directly, they were much more thorough. I'm going to give you two more reasons and then we'll move on because books have been written about this. But the other reason why things happen so quickly, Greece has a terrible experience of the Second World War, a terrible experience. And for those of you who follow the news today, if you think about how horribly Greece suffered in recent years under the EU's, I'm forgetting the word, thank you, austerity campaign. In Greece, there were comparisons between the EU austerity campaign and the German occupation. Because when the Germans, I mean, obviously it's not a fair comparison, but I'll explain that when the Germans occupied Greece, and Italy was responsible for this as well during an earlier stage of the war, they stripped Greece of its resources. They stripped Greece of its food. They took fish from the sea. They took grains from the field. And the women and men and children of Greece, Christian as well as Jewish, suffered a terrible famine even before the deportation of Jews, which meant that it was so much harder for this community to have the wherewithal, the energy to flee. Some did flee and some did hide, but it was much harder. There are other reasons too that have to do with the timing of war, but you can see it's a reminder of just how complicated Holocaust stories always are. You know, the timeline is never simple. So, please. Yeah, it's fascinating. There is a line somewhere where we lose our identity ourselves and our own particularity, and we just melt into culture, physically. And I think what's so interesting about that is that different people perceive the line to be located in different places. And it's in that generates argument. And the arguments can be painful, but in a way that's also what keeps the community dynamic, is trying to hash that out, trying to hash out where Jewishness begins and where it threatens to end. Yes, please.
I'm curious if he was a printer, and so did he actually print his own music?
No. Well, there's a wonderful book, if you want to get in a little bit more into the musical history, there's a wonderful book by a former student of mine named Maureen Jackson, who wrote about this phenomenon of Ottoman musicians playing together, musicians of different religious backgrounds. But printed music was really late to the game. It was long after Saadi's time. In his time, most of it was not written at all, but they were beginning to hash out a notational system. I don't really have the proper musical language. They were beginning to hash out a system for recording, but mostly it was by memory, by ear, by the passage. And that's why who you studied with was so important, because they held within their mind a world of music, a whole tradition of music. There is a notational system, a system of writing that comes later, and right now, this specific Judeo-Spanish Sephardic musical tradition is really experiencing, well, it's experiencing a new fascination on the part of listeners, but it's also in an almost highly vulnerable, near extinct status. Yeah. Yes, Rabbi.
Obstacles, political obstacles, to their
Well, I would say that it's not really fair to say that they didn't participate in larger culture. And here the music is a good example. This practicing of music together created, I think, what we can really only call an Ottoman music culture that Jews helped shape. And there are other examples of that. I mean, if you think of the realms of food, or if you think of the realm of cuisine, or of the arts, you could make the same argument that Jews are participating. There are Jewish intellectuals who are working just as European Jewish intellectuals are to create a Jewish Enlightenment movement, who are writing works of scholarship, who are translating world literature into Ladino. I think where we really see a difference is that there isn't ever an elite that totally assimilates. And that's what we find even in the Russian Empire. There was, through the 19th century, an elite population, a small population of wealthy Jews who became Russian for all intents and purposes, or became Polish, depending where they were. You don't really find that anywhere. There are Jews who were masters of Arabic or masters of Ottoman Turkish, for example, who were leading doctors or scientists, women whose sewing was known. Saadi's mother was a famous, storied seamstress. And all of the consular representatives from across Europe who came to Salonika would go to her to have their shirts made. And she was the first one to introduce a Western-style shirt to Salonika. So there were ways that Jews did participate, but they never, there was never a population that really assimilated in the way, you think of the Jews of Berlin or Vienna, where there was an elite population that managed, they thought, to almost seamlessly integrate. There's no equivalent to that. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all.
We're going to take 10 minutes to stretch, to get a cup of coffee, to get a little more dessert, and then we'll retreat. We'll remain back here. We'll come back here for the beginning of our Sephardic. Sorry? Yes, we'll be coming back here for our Sephardic Selichot service. When you come back, we'll unwrap the table, and we're going to ask everybody to take one of the Sephardic machzors. The machzor is the machzor that we use in our own Sephardic service here. We have enough for everybody tonight. And the words of all of the poetry that the band and Asher are going to be singing for us tonight are in that machzor. So please, on your way back in, take one of the machzors. Everybody stand up, get a little air, get a cup of coffee, have a piece of fruit, have another ice cream bar. Don't leave the building. Bring your sin back in, and we'll have slichot together.
Thank you. Trajan. Oh, what am I doing? So.